Hello, namaste, and welcome back to the Indian Wisdom Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Raj Balkaran. I know that the podcast has been a bit sporadic as of late. There have been a great many teaching opportunities and travel opportunities to teach in person that I've been called to take. But soon, I believe in the fall, we'll have more of a regular rhythm of the podcast, at least every other week, if not every week. But for this episode, I could not help but cross post my epic conversation with fine Sanskritist and fine teacher Dr. Antonia Ruppel. We talk about learning Sanskrit. We talk about learning Sanskrit at the Academy and beyond. We talk about the nature and transformations of the learning paradigms and the training paradigms that we both are a product of. I think it's quite a fitting and useful chat for those of you who might be interested in studying with Antonia or learning Sanskrit, or at very least learning about the setting for Sanskrit training and the various colorful textures involved in academic training and being an independent scholar. Antonio also is an independent scholar who is also affiliated with various institutions, past and present. And so she really is a kindred spirit because she is, to my mind at least, a teacher, a fine teacher, first and foremost a teacher, or at least a person who empathizes with the needs of others, which typically makes for an excellent teacher. So it's not just that we care about mastery of content, whether storytelling, whether the Puranas, whether Sanskrit grammar, whether whatever. I think that the sweet spot is where you have the rigor, you have the knowledge, and you also have concern and care and empathy for other people. To my mind, that's what makes excellent education. And it's clear to me that Antonia, without putting words in her mouth, very much would share in that approach, I feel. So, given the sort of embodied, rich, fun nature of our conversation, I think it's a great fit for the News and podcast as well. In addition to that, uh, unlike New Books Network, the Indian Wisdom podcast offers the opportunity for a visual interface. Now, the vast majority of our listeners, of course, listen on Apple Podcasts, etc. But for those, many of my students are not even aware there was a visual component. That's how great I am at marketing, apparently. Um, but there is a YouTube channel. And so you can see Antonia and you can see what she is doing with her hands throughout the podcast. It's captivating. It's not mudras, maybe a modern mudra. Well, I'll leave it to your imagination if you're interested. Check out the YouTube channel. And either way, enjoy the audio. Okay, here we go. Bye for now. Hello, and welcome back to the New Books in Indian Religions podcast, a podcast channel here on the New Books Network. I'm your host, Dr. Raj Balkaran. More importantly, I have the pleasure of welcoming back to the podcast Dr. Antonia Ruppel, who is a fine Sanskritist and, if you can believe it, also a fine Sanskrit teacher.
Well, hi, Raj. Very nice
Welcome.
to be back here.
Yes, those who have listened to the podcast and or studied with Antonia will be aware that she is the author of Sanskrit textbooks. She's written the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit. There's also an introductory reader. We talked about Vedic sentences last, I believe. Today we're going to take a bit of a deep dive ancillarily into one of her new German language publications for Sanskrit. But more so, we will gain insight into the lay of the land in terms of her journey with publishing, her journey with language training, her sort of awareness of where folks are at with classical languages. Really, this was spawned by a really fascinating thread on the Indology listserv. For those of you who have no idea what that is, don't worry about it. It's a nerdy academic listserv. But really good things can come of academic listservs, I assure you, such as this. So, Antonia, why don't you tell us maybe a bit about any of those threads that you're interested in talking about first? Maybe your publishing journey with this new text, perhaps, or
Well, so I think what I'm kind of known for is my English language Cambridge University Press Sanskrit textbook, the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit. I am not an Indologist by training, I'm a classicist, and that textbook that I wrote for my own classes and my first job was kind of my sort of ticket into the world of Indology. So people thought I could maybe do this because I had written this book. And I wrote a German version of it. So this is a new textbook that I've just finished and that I've just that came out last month. For the simple reason that I was teaching in Germany, at university in Germany, and my sort of teaching feedback was generally quite good, but there was this one point of criticism, which was we would quite like a German language, a German textbook. And so I thought, you know what, I'd been thinking about writing one of those for a while anyways. I didn't want to translate the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit for two reasons. Cambridge holds the copyright, and so I can't just go and translate my own book into another language. I needed their permission and the permission of another German publisher for that. So, plus, my teaching always focuses on taking into account what my students already know about languages and about language when I teach them a new language, when I teach them Sanskrit. And so teaching Sanskrit to speakers of German is in many ways easier than teaching Sanskrit to speakers of English, because German is closer in various grammatical features to Sanskrit than English is. And so I decided I'll just write a new textbook that is geared exactly towards speakers of German. One clear parallel is German has these monster compounds that everybody on the internet likes to make fun of. Well, Sanskrit does as well. And so if you're already used to monster compounds because you're a speaker of German, then looking at those compounds in Sanskrit is still going to be scary, but nowhere near as scary as when you're coming from English, for example. And so I wrote that textbook. That was about 4 years ago, and I then started using it in class. I used it 1 year, then overhauled it over the summer, used it again, then overhauled it over the summer, and then wrote a full set of exercises, all the material that you need to make a full textbook a full textbook. And then I was thinking about who to publish it with, and in the end I went for self-publishing with Amazon, and I'm happy to talk about my reasoning for that. And so 2 weeks after I finished polishing it and checking it, it then came out with Amazon. So it's called Kindle Digital Publishing. It's not actually on the Kindle, it's a regular printed book, but it's with Amazon. And
yes.
So
yeah, absolutely.
the video version of the podcast, ta-da, here is the textbook, and another, ta-da, here is the workbook. So.
Yeah, fascinating. So many intriguing threads, not least of which German getting all the press time for monster compounds. Kidding. So the Amazon links are in the podcast notes for those of you who want to look at the publication, obviously for German speakers learning Sanskrit. But yeah, we would love, the audience would love to learn about, we're interested in trends in scholarship, trends in publication, trends in digital media, trends like, this podcast is much more than publications. It's really mapping out the scaffolding whereby we do our academic, intellectual, pedagogical work. And so the world of publishing is being transformed as we speak. It won't look the same in a century, there's no question. And so tell us a bit about your journey. Why did you opt to publish with Amazon, and what was that like?
Well, a couple of things here. So I am at this point mostly self-employed. I still am affiliated with a university for whom I teach, but my main affiliation is independent scholar.
Amen, sister.
And I love it. My main employer is Yogic Studies, for whom I teach many, I want to say many wonderful courses, but that would sound awfully self-serving. So for which I teach many courses that I enjoy very much. But the reason why I mention this is that academic publishing is this weird thing where, on the one hand, you would think that we publish things in order to advance the state of human knowledge, in order to disseminate our thoughts. But the world of academia is such that there is a pressure to publish, even when you don't have anything to say. And so you need to publish, not necessarily in order for a new thought to be read, but you need to publish in order for a new line to appear on your CV. That publishing, so that it counts as a line on your CV, needs to be peer reviewed. And peer reviewing usually works, or traditionally works, through academic publishers. Now, with this book, I don't need it as a line on my CV. The only reason why I put it out there is so that my students who want to buy it can buy it quite easily. And it's cheaper than if I send them the PDF and they print it out, because if you publish on Amazon, you can keep the price really low, which is lovely. And so basically the only reason for publishing is that I wanted the book to be available. I didn't want it to take a year or two between me sending it in to the publisher and the book actually seeing the light. I wanted it to be affordable. And so, for example, the textbook, which is the main part of the work, is €10 or around $10. I wanted it to be such that no one who is, an expert publisher, but not an expert teacher, can tell me how to do the layout. So this is not a monograph that you read. This is a book that you work with. You just need certain kinds of things all to be on the same page. You need the print to be a certain minimum font size, which is an eternal fight with traditional publishers. And so for all of those reasons, and even though I am fully aware of the moral ambiguities and the moral problems involved in publishing with Amazon, I then decided to go with them because the book is out there, it's practical, it's out there now, it is out there affordable. If someone tells me, oh, by the way, on that page you made a mistake, there's a typo or whatever, I can just go change it and then say, oh, by the way, this is the version with the changes from, I don't know, August 2025, and the changes will appear in no time at all. Whereas trying to do that with a traditionally published book, it can be either challenging or impossible.
Yeah,
And so that's why.
I find that endlessly fascinating. There are so many threads there. I think you started off with this comment about being content as in someone who's independent. I think of it as self-employed in a sense. I find the term independent scholar to be, in certain ways, apt. In other ways, not quite a great fit, because independent scholar can be code for so many other things, of which neither you or I are. And you and I are probably some of the most connected people in our niche that exist. And
Exactly,
so
I am
we're not
so not independent.
right. So I don't know how to think of it, because never in 1,000 years did I think I'd ever work for myself. I did it out of necessity, given the current job market. And then it became quite fulfilling and comfortable. I mean, just to be clear, I would absolutely welcome a professorship that was a good fit to complement much of the enterprise, that I've been able to engage thus far. It's been close to a decade since defending. Having said that, being able to create a course and have it launch within 2 months at the Indian Muslim School is a dream come true, in a sense. Being able to teach people who are there to learn, not to please mommy or daddy for grades alone. I mean, it's I pinch myself. I mean, people are showing up looking for knowledge that I could offer them. It's something, very accessible and very affordable. So I love that you, and I noted this from our very first conversation, just instinctively, and then I have more data points as our podcast conversations continue. You're always cognizant of the audience, of the
Yeah.
students and their experience. And that sort of uber empathy is extraordinary, I think, especially in academia. Often, for thinking types, where we have different skills. Obviously, we have all sorts of different skills, but to have that's crucial, to always think. And more, many of our fine scholars are training themselves to keep front of mind the audience, the student experience. But to think, sure, Amazon, for all the ills of Amazon, where do people get their stuff really quickly, right?
Yes.
So I think the speed of publication, along with the accessibility, the affordability of the publication, certainly makes it worth it in a certain sense. And oh, do I wish that I could wave a wand and correct typos in a monograph? No question. There was some interest for which I take full responsibility. There was some interesting debacle with an appendix of my second book that I thought Routledge had sent out for review along with the actual body of the text, which wasn't. It was a misunderstanding. It's all right. I should have been clear. But do I wish I can go back and correct some of these things in the blink of an eye? Of course. I mean, who has that kind of luxury when you're so really it seems that independent publication is comparable to independent vocation or employment in that you have this agility and this you're able to just get stuff done at a much quicker pace. um
There is, if I might interrupt, I mean, there is that, but when you say I'm sort of cognizant of my audience, of the students, I have the feeling that many people who are in TradAc, so who have regular university posts, would want to be that as well. But very often people are punished for spending the time they would want to spend on course prep and on teaching, because teaching well takes a lot of time to prepare your classes, to run your classes, to interact with your students. That takes energy, that takes time, that takes experience. But what academics are rewarded for is not their teaching, it is their publications. So I know young academics who've been told explicitly, you know what, you do the teaching on the side with as little effort as you can, and what you need to focus on is your publishing, is your research and your publishing. And I think that, when you say I'm cognizant of my audience, I'm pretty certain that many others want to be that as well. But in the traditional academic setup, increasingly, you can't, because there is not just research and teaching, there is so much admin that is these days given to academics as well. And if you are in a traditional academic job, then there's only so much of you. And if you do 50% research, 50% teaching, and 30% admin, it's just not maintainable. You can't keep it up. And so what I want to say is, in short, the reason why I'm happy outside academia is that I can be, fully there for my students. But one of the reasons why I also didn't make it in traditional academia is because I refused to take the well-meaning advice to, just publish, and do the teaching on the side. For me, the teaching is kind of the most important thing, and the most joyful thing, and the most resultful thing. That's the word. So just wanted to put that in there.
yeah, thank you for sharing your perspective. um uh, would you say that certainly I'm aware of the culture that you're speaking of. Would you say that it's different, that perhaps there are institutions on par with what are called in America sort of R1 institutions, and perhaps there are certain colleges that are more like liberal arts colleges that are, would you say there's a bit of a spectrum in that regard, or would you say that ethos is innate to academia as a whole, in your experience?
Well, my experience, I have never taught at a small liberal arts college. So where I think exactly what I'm describing, namely the importance of teaching and being there for your students, is much greater than it would be at an R1 university. But unfortunately, we are often in the situation that, especially the more exotic subjects, and Sanskrit is kind of my life, but I know that in the larger scheme of things, it is exotic, is often offered at R1 institutions and then maybe at one or two other places. Or even if you possibly have a Sanskritist somewhere, then they would be part of a department that contains South Asia, contains ancient languages, contains specific religions or something like that, but they're not as part of the Sanskrit department, which you kind of need if you want, a person to be there for the introductory teaching, for the intermediate teaching, then for the advanced teaching, for all the, teaching that you gain access to once you have mastered the language and so on. So I think you're absolutely right that there are institutions where teaching is important, but very often the kind of depth that you want to go into for any field, not just South Asian studies, but basically any cultures, in any subject that studies any culture or cultures, you want to have a certain depth that I think there is probably, and people may correct me, is there not quite available because you have more breadth, more general approaches, because one person cannot represent an entire field.
Yeah, I mean that's so intriguing that there's something of an ethos in academia, and certainly there are various mandates and agendas for different sorts of institutions, and then overlaying atop all of that, there's the uniqueness and the unique issues of how specialized. I fully understand what you say when you say Sanskrit's exotic, and yet there's not a day that goes by where there's not a Sanskrit word in my brain, on my iPhone, in teaching. And so absolutely, I mean, sort of Indology or Indic studies, or Hindu studies and religious studies departments, or Sanskrit studies. Well, certainly we are very much marginalized with respect to the greater academic thrusts and interests and all that. And I find it endlessly fascinating that there are people such as yourself, such as myself, such as Seth Powell, such as probably many more that I don't know about, who are finding a way to do what they're here to do, irrespective of the confines of institutional structures, or even the degradation of those very structures. And I really can't help but think that, my sense is that there will always be an academy, but that we are part of the change to complement that and create space. And sort of, never in 1,000 years, I don't even think it would have been possible even 10 years earlier than when I was situated to do what I'm doing independently. I think the world has changed so much. Would you agree with that? Like, how do you feel about this whole independent thing? I mean, do you feel like it's niche, or do you feel like it's the new norm, or how do you feel about it?
Well, I talk about it in terms of trad-ac and alt-ac. So trad-ac, traditional academia, would be universities, colleges, institutes of higher education, which have their wonderful strengths, and increasingly I feel they have weaknesses, and these weaknesses. Alt-ac institutions, such as yourself, School of Indian Wisdom, yogic studies, and so on. So institutions like that are are filling the gaps that are left by academic teaching, which are that there is huge interest in what we offer. And when I say we, I don't mean, people involved with Sanskrit or South Asian studies. It can be pretty much anything, it can be Korean studies, it can be Japanese studies, it can be Chinese studies. It can be any culture on earth that there is something interesting to study about, which is, I think, most of them. And with some, we have the great fortune of having language and literature in great depth. There are so many people that are interested in learning about these things in depth, in detail. And often university studies in these fields are aimed at focusing your resources on those students who are then going to be the future of that field in academia. So I've seen it a number of times that, I always try to keep my classes as broad as I can and invite anyone who wants to learn Sanskrit, to have an A at the end of the course and continue maybe even to graduate studies, to someone who just wants to get the basic gist and then do whatever with it afterwards. I welcome everyone in my classes, but then I see regularly that at the higher level, they're weeded out so that you can focus your resources on those who will be the next generation of Indologists, the next generation of classicists, the next generation of Indo-Europeanists. And I think that's understandable to a certain extent, but I think it's a big shame. I wish that universities and colleges weren't in a place where they do this or have to do this. And places like yogic studies, for which I work regularly, fills that gap by offering teaching in things that many people are interested in at a level that is really aimed at everyone who wants to learn. And, everyone who has the tenacity to then stick with 3 terms of introductory Sanskrit. So, you're in week 30 of your Sanskrit studies, and we're still calling the course that you're in introductory Sanskrit. So people who are willing to do that, they are all welcome. And in universities, for a variety of reasons, most of them financial, that just is not the case. Then also, I think the classroom is a magical space, and I love teaching in person. I've just come back from a 5-day in-person retreat, which is just wonderful. But with universities being in a physical space, that means that someone who lives, in the middle of Iowa, in the middle of Wyoming, in some rural part of wherever, probably cannot access easily a university that offers these subjects. And if you know how to use online resources such as Zoom and others well, you can now offer really high quality teaching. What I offer at Yogic Studies is exactly what I taught at Cornell, exactly what I did at Oxford, exactly what I did at Munich. So, proper academic teaching online to be accessed by anyone who either is awake while the classes are happening, which, means in some time zones, no, or is able to then watch the classes as a recording afterwards and then, ask me their questions offline. So I think places like Yogic Studies and the Indian Wisdom School are the future. They are going to become going to become more and more prominent. I very much hope that other institutions or other organizations are going to come up that supplement what we do, and there already are quite a few online places. I know them in religious studies. I know them in classics. I have the feeling none are quite as professional as what we have in South Asian studies, but they are growing because there is a need for them.
Yeah, that's it's so utterly fascinating. I keep saying the F word so much, fascinating, but I can't help but being
The F word.
so fascinating. Um, the at the outset you were talking about the interest, interest in Korean studies, interest in, etc., American studies, South Asian studies. There's no question. And how meta is it that where are we having this conversation? At New Books Network that has, I don't know, somewhere between 100 and 200 subject specific podcast channels where it's the largest podcast platform on the planet. And people are coming out in droves, or not coming out, they're listening in droves out of interest. They're interested. It's not, the world has changed so much that the online sphere is not just the fast food domain. There's now fine dining in the Wild West, right? The online sphere is so large. There's everything from, Uncle Apu's views on on whatever Sanskrit or Indology, and then there's university level instruction. So accessibility, online accessibility, contrary to perhaps perceptions or even precedent, online accessibility is not happening at the expense of rigor, of impact. And it's a beautiful marriage. And I don't even know. I'm sort of too in it to see it, and it's sort of just happening all around me. I wonder if at some point there might be some college, some university, some department, silly enough to entertain a scholar who may want to just transform their relationship with undergrads, recruit, sort of build some of what we do online. I wonder how much of it is translatable to sort of the college university spaces. And I don't know. I think it's an open question, but there is a vast interest and need for this knowledge, such that people are paying out of pocket relatively affordably because they're interested. They don't need a grade. Some of them like a certificate. Most of them don't care. It's not about pleasing mommy or daddy or grandma. And there's, the University of Toronto has had a continuing studies school for decades, continuing education. I taught there from 2010 to about 2020-ish, when I kind of moved over to the Oxford Centre for Indian Studies to satisfy my continuing studies age institutionally. And, even the Toronto District School Board I remember I was a teenager working for the Toronto District School Board, and one summer I was working at a call center. I didn't even know continuing studies existed. I was a 16-year-old working at a call center where we were taking call. In those days, you would call in to book your spot for this course. And I was booking people into all these courses and all kinds of subjects. I mean, that was my first exposure to sort of general interest education that wasn't just, someone's basement. It was the Toronto District School Board. And eventually the University of Toronto, now the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. People are interested. And I do think, I think it's more than just catering to the interest. I also do think on some level, it's in the interest of our disciplines. I'll speak for myself, and it's the interest, and it's in the interest of religious studies in general and Hindu studies in particular to address not sacrificing rigor or even pedigree or any of that, but to cater to nourish people with this knowledge in a way that that makes sense to them and they can use in their lives in some way. I mean, there's a lot there. I don't know. I'm foaming at the mouth, but what do you think about any of that?
Well, again, a couple of things come to mind. First, there often is, I don't know whether it's a looking down on or a fear of education outside academia, because the idea is that, well, in academia we have rigor. In academia we strive for objectivity, for neutrality, whereas outside those are amateurs, dilettantes. And both amateur and dilettante literally means someone who loves the subject. One is French, the other is Italian, but in English, they both have negative connotations. And the idea is that if you're outside academia, then you have someone who appropriates the subject for some non-neutral purpose and distorts knowledge, publishes or, disseminates information that is just wrong. And I just had a conversation with the people at the retreat where I was at about the fact that, well, it's funny that amateur, so, someone who loves something is somehow seen as lesser, when I think that the love for a subject, the enthusiasm for a subject is what gets you going. And then even if you're enthusiastic, you are nevertheless, I would like to think, totally able to remain as rigorous as possible, as neutral as possible. There's always a question of how neutral can you be and still be a useful participant in a subject, as objective as possible. I think that we need to permit ourselves the thought that the love, the enthusiasm for something really has a space in serious studies. Then, you were just mentioning, so continuing education at the University of Toronto. I just read that, and I feel terrible but I'm about to say something negative about Cornell, and I love Cornell, where I taught for 9 years. And so I say this consciously. I just read an article that Cornell is admitting people from, the nearby communities, from Ithaca and thereabouts, to participate, to take Cornell classes on a non-degree basis. So you can enroll in individual courses without having to apply to become a Cornell student. And on the one hand, I think that's great. And for example, you can enroll for their Sanskrit classes, which as far as I know are very, very good. I know the person who teaches them. I think they're great. They use my textbook, so obviously I think that the textbook is good. But if you do this via Cornell, what do you get? A credit hour costs $1,900. One semester of intro Sanskrit is 4 credit hours. Now, the complete introduction to Sanskrit is 2 semesters, so 8 credit hours, which comes up to somewhere between $15,000 and $16,000. For that, you do get live instruction, absolutely. But for example, you get around, I think it's 28 or 29 weeks. At yogic studies, you get 36 weeks, 3 terms. You get the textbook, you get the author of the textbook, you get the same number of contact hours, and it costs $900. And I just wish that I mean, on the one hand, it is wonderful for me that universities in North America are so overpriced, because it means that there is yet another reason for people to come to, for example, yogic studies. But on the other hand, of course, I need to make a living, but I would so like it if the sorts of things that I teach were available, were affordable, were accessible to the larger public, and not just to people who can afford to spend $16,000 on studying Sanskrit. Because my firm belief is that if you pursue an education, no matter whether it's in Sanskrit or in anything else, if you pursue an education, training of the mind, that means you learn how to assess and work productively in your mind with large amounts of information. A language is various interlocking systems of large amounts of information. Whether you study a language or anything else, I think that kind of education, that kind of training of the mind is what we need for democracies to keep going. Because if you don't have people who can think on their feet, and of course, you can learn how to think on your feet outside universities, but in universities, in colleges, it's a lot easier because you're shown the way. If we don't have lots of people who can think of their feet, on their feet, then we have instead lots of people who fall for, demagoguery, for propaganda, for people who tell them something that they may want to hear, but that will never lead to any productive, positive result. And, the rise of autocrats in democracies around the world, I attribute to universities in many places not really being there for general education, but being increasingly there to train people. And training is very important, but we do need the purpose-free introduction to large amounts of knowledge that is an education. And so this leads me back to, places like yogic studies, which are affordable. We need more of them. But we kind of also need universities to become more like yogic studies, which is open also for the enthusiasts and gently showing the enthusiasts the way, but remaining affordable.
Yeah, this is what I strongly suspect, and this is why I have this sort of fantasy or instinct or intuition or hoop dream that, at the right institutional fit, at that site, we can change, shift, alchemize, say, religious studies and the ways in which we teach and the ways in which we access, maybe even alchemize online education at that site or public engagement. I mean, imagine a professorship, at least in my case, where none of the following are occupational hazards: public engagement, teaching, or lived experience. Imagine a place where these are features, not bugs. And I do think, not to take away from the importance and the rigor of traditional academic training, but to augment it for its very survival and to fill the needs of people who desire and require education. And I think you framed it. I think that is the broadest and best frame. Part of the reason why that people, as you say, who think on their feet, are sort of don't fall prey to demagoguery is because demagogues are insistent to quash the means of people thinking on their feet and to quash education programs. That's not by chance, because obviously there's that connection is well known. So yeah, it's sort of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater with academia, but also, I don't see us as not part of academia. I see us as very much part of academia, but sort of academia 2.0, unless we define academia as traditional university settings, sort of the pursuit and dissemination of knowledge, research, rigorous research, critical thinking. In my case, even something along the lines of above and beyond intellectual formation, even person formation in certain situations. And so I think these outcomes are sorely desired. And I think that it's in the university's best interests to meet the needs of these populations without, of course, sacrificing rigor. But see, when rigor is meant to be sort of a methodology to safeguard intellectualism, it tends to be an ideology to safeguard classism. at the same time. And we have to be clear as to whether or not we want people to think straight or whether or not we want to be in a different class.
Yeah.
And I think
And that was one of the most depressing things that I realized when I came to Germany. So I'm a product of the British system. I was an undergrad the first year that fees were introduced. Still, very moderate compared to the US, but they had fees. And then I taught at Cornell, which of course, as most institutions of its kind, has considerable fees. Then when I came back to the UK, fees had gone up to between £9,000 and £12,000. And then I came to Germany, where there are no tuition fees. They had an experiment with tuition fees for a while, where a semester cost, I think, €500 or something like that. And then fortunately, they got rid of it. And so I thought, this is wonderful. Finally, I'm in a system that is accessible. Until I've realized that, especially in the nicer subjects, i.e. in the arts and humanities, you had quite a few people of, quite a few proper people. And there are ways well beyond charging enormous fees to make sure that only the proper students continue with their studies. One such way, for example, is if you're a student who first generation university student, there's a good chance that you will not have heard the word Sanskrit while you grow up. I am a second generation university student. My father went to university. My parents both went to university. Well, no, goodness, my grandfather was a professor, so I'm at least third generation university student. But I had never heard the word Sanskrit growing up. I heard about it by chance when I was an undergrad, and so many people will not have heard of Sanskrit, Pali, Akkadian, all these Aramaic, all these fascinating languages and their cultures that you can study. And if you basically rig the system so that only people who know right from the start what they want to do, and who know that they are aiming at a career in academia, which is something that you can do with financial safety only if you are from a financially better off household, then you do keep out the riffraff. I'm using air quotes here. You do keep out the riffraff from the nicer subjects, from the proper subjects, from the cultural studies, and so on, even when you're not charging fees. Now, charging fees is something that the system does, and so that is a gatekeeper more generally. For the other system, you need to have certain people in place, certain professors in place to be the gatekeepers. But I was rather shocked to see that even people younger than me can be very, very gatekeepy. And I thought, why, if we have someone who comes to us because they want to learn Sanskrit, we teach them Sanskrit to the best of our ability. I don't care that this person is, as I say, first generation student. Often those have the most interesting approaches to everything. Because they haven't been told how to think. They haven't been shown how to think. They are not in anybody's footsteps. They're forging their own way. And I find that universities need to be more accessible, which in some places means they need to be cheaper, way cheaper. And in other places means we need to get off our high horse and stop thinking that someone is a god because they're a professor, and someone else who does not happen to have a professorship but is a really seasoned scholar, successful scholar, good teacher, good researcher, everything, great colleague, is not a god because they don't happen to have that professor's title. Sorry, I get worked up about this every time that I talk about it, even though it's not news.
no, no, it's great that you're impassioned and this matters to you. And I've noticed in life that people really don't typically care how much you know until consciously or unconsciously they know how much you care. They sense that you are motivated by something above and beyond arid intellectualism, and everybody is. And we're just self-deluded when we think that we're automatons or we're AI. We're living, breathing human beings. We have values, we have experiences, we have wounds, we have hopes, fears, dreams, ambitions. Some of us are lucky enough to have a vision of how we might like society, or at least our corner of it, to operate. And yeah, you're sharing your experience, and that's great. What would you say to a scholar that hopefully was voicing this in a charitable manner, not someone intent on poo-pooing whatever's not, prestigious. But what would you say to a scholar? Say, hey, Antonia, I know you're a fine scholar. I imagine that this publication is going to be exceptionally useful for native German speaking budding Sanskritists. But this whole Amazon apparatus, is there peer review? Should there be peer review? I mean, is there anybody to peer review this? Like, how would we address this in this sort of new setup that we're co-creating?
Yeah. I feel, and I'm not saying anything new here, that there are many, many problems with the peer review system. And I feel that if the goal of our publications was the dissemination of knowledge entering into academic discourse and so on, then by far the best way to do that these days would be on a Substack. Yeah, so I have thoughts. I publish them on my Substack or on my blog or on MySpace. I don't know if that still exists, but that's sort of where people of a certain generation first were introduced to this, where I can be as cutesy and personal and whatnot as I want. But these spaces are great for the dissemination of knowledge, where I then say, look, this is what I want to say. And maybe it's just an idea that I have, and it's just 2 paragraphs, which would be too short for most academic articles. Maybe I have an idea that I've been brooding over for quite some time, and I just need some feedback. I want people to read it, and so I put it out there, and you say, these are my sources. This is my approach towards this. This is my approach towards that. And anybody who makes it through the end of that very, very long Substack or blog post is welcome to comment on it. Then that is great for disseminating knowledge and for engendering discussion, for getting feedback. But it's not something where I put, where my output is something that has already been given the stamp of approval of peer review. But I need the peer review stamp of approval to play the rules of the academic game and to get another line in my list of publications. I'm sorry that I say this so very, negatively, but that's what sometimes it can be. And I feel that by publishing on Amazon, I kind of do the equivalent of publishing in such a way that I make information accessible. I know that what I am saying is as good as it can be. I say in the prefix and in the preface, if there's mistakes, if there's typos, please let me know. Here's my email address. I'd be very, very grateful if you let me know, if you tell me. But I know that what I am putting out there is as good as I can make it be, and I know that it's useful. And for any honest publication, that is exactly what it is. Any honest publication is there because someone wants to put out something they've discovered, something they've thought of, a new approach, a new synthesis. But there are also lots of publications out there because some people in some PhD programs are told you need to have a publication, otherwise you won't get your PhD. There are publications out there that are out there because people are told you need to have so many publications, otherwise we won't renew your contract, we won't give you tenure, we won't make you a full professor, and so on. And so, unfortunately, it's for those that peer review kind of is necessary to weed out what is obviously not good. But for the dissemination of knowledge, I find that the current process of publication, where I send something in, it usually takes a long time to get a reaction. Then usually I have to respond. Usually then there's another time for someone else to respond. That kind of thing. And then it's out there in an article that unless you're part of an institution that is subscribed to that journal or to that publisher, you probably can't access anyway because it's behind a paywall. That just is not there to disseminate knowledge and engender discussion. That is there to make sure to gatekeep academic publication so that we can then use this metric as a sort of bar above which you must come so that you can be kept in academia, you can be promoted or whatnot. That
Yeah,
would be my answer.
yeah, it's it's so intriguing the extent to which, to be charitable to all sides, the extent to which gatekeeping is a form of quality control versus a form of social exclusion, a form of sort of bolstering hierarchy for a variety of reasons that has little to do with the quality of the knowledge and has everything to do with social dynamics, we can say, to put it mildly. And so, yeah, I mean, certainly, I was in an interesting space when I defended, and I find myself on this path. This path found me somehow, some decade later, and there is an intriguing assistant professorship that I'm considering applying for, and one of my colleagues, a respected and amiable colleague, says, do you think you want this job? I said, what do you mean? I mean, if it's a decent fit, and they were like, well, you've got two monographs published, a dozen articles, and a couple edited volumes. You at this point, I mean, you may want to apply for an associate position. It goes from you're underqualified to now that you're overqualified at this point. Unless they're going to hire you for an associate position, or you want to, you may be a flight risk to them in their view. I mean, it's so intriguing because the power dynamics of all this. So I will continue to the best of my ability to publish with reputable presses so that I'm competitive in the event that this position opens up that I think would be a great mutual benefit. But I do toy with the idea. I mean, the Stadium translation that Suni's taken interest in, I do toy with the idea of making it far more accessible by publishing it myself. By the same token, I mean, I can effect the benefits of peer review by asking you graciously for a favor, or even compensating someone as skilled as yourself or other colleagues to be like, hey, what do you make of these creative liberties to make the English flow? We can find ways
Yeah.
to vet it and credit our colleagues in footnotes, as is often the case, and all that. So I do find it interesting, but I also find so much is changing. The world is changing, and part of this conversation is registering the ways in which the most adaptive of us, the most responsive of us, among us, are responding to the changing needs of students, of structures. And it's such a moving target. And I just think we're just super ahead of a curve that's inevitable. There's no question in my mind that in a century, academic publishing will look very, very, very different. It's just a question of how we get there, and what replaces the dodo. you know.
Yes, and the traditional structures, the traditional publishers, they, I think, so far are a lot better at keeping things available, keeping them in print. Also, traditional publishers have, agreements with many great university libraries, which make sure that a copy of that book is definitely accessible, either for people at that institution or via interlibrary loan. Likewise, traditional academic institutions, their value is immeasurable. I definitely would not be where I am if I hadn't been through a traditional academic education. I was lucky; I had some very, very, very good teachers.
Amen,
But
sister.
yeah, there you go. I would assume that this applies to, or also Seth Powell, founder of Yogic Studies. He had an excellent education at excellent places. He also brings a lot to the table that I think he probably didn't learn at university. So his business acumen and design sense. I don't know to what extent that was fostered within his degrees, but we all wouldn't be here without traditional academic education. Traditional academic education is what people know of. This is what people standardly go into after they finish secondary school, and so we need something that combines the well-knownness and the structures, the continuity of the traditional academic institutions with the accessibility and the student friendliness, the learner friendliness of what I call alt-ac for short.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that some sort of cross pollination or hybridity is needed, because in no way, shape, or form do I intend to overtly or even covertly denigrate my own education or my valuing of university education. I live for it. It just, this path has called me. I've never in a thousand years saw myself working for myself. I don't see myself as an innovator. But at the same time, it seems that I've been left no choice but to innovate, to create the space I need for the students who need us, for the kinds of things that I want to teach people. But I do think the pendulum will swing the other way, where the smart, sort of on the ball institutions are going to integrate some of what we've learned out in the jungle with a machete or two, and some of what we learned about living in the forest for a while. The kings will learn from the forest hermits. I think it's so goes the story, anyways. But Tell me a bit about you're teaching a really fascinating course, or about to teach a fascinating course that commingles your knowledge of classical languages, not just Sanskrit. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah.
And I would love to learn about your perspectives on trends in language training these days.
On what? Sorry, I didn't hear that.
In language training, trends in language training, and sort of.
So the course, to answer that directly, the course that I'm about to offer for the first time starting in mid-September is called Ancient Greek for Sanskritists. It comes at the heels of a course that I taught this past academic year called Latin for Sanskritists. And so traditionally in Europe, the situation, or in the Europe, North America, at least the Anglophone world, traditionally the path has always been that you would have secondary students learning Latin and perhaps Greek, and then those students going to university and learning Sanskrit. And in the old days, when pretty much everyone who came to university would have had Latin knowledge, A, because Latin was more prevalent at schools, and B, because universities were way more exclusive. People who would have learned Sanskrit would already have had knowledge of Latin and Greek. And you can tell from pretty much all the old resources that they build on that. Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit are very, very similar. And all the old resources basically are written for people who learn Sanskrit who have already learned at least Latin and perhaps already Greek, and thus know lots and lots of the basics of Sanskrit grammar already. So that was also the case with me. I learned Latin and Greek in school, and then I learned Sanskrit with Teach Yourself Sanskrit by Michael Coulson later on while I was at university. And through yogic studies, for which I started teaching in 2020, for which I started teaching Sanskrit in 2020. Through yogic studies, we have now created a group of people who have already studied Sanskrit, at least for a year or two or more, and who, because I of course can't shut up about my first love, Latin and Greek, who are interested in Latin and Greek, or perhaps independently from me are interested in Latin and Greek, and who are now teaching, last year it was Latin, this year it's Ancient Greek, on the basis of their knowledge of Sanskrit. So Sanskrit has a huge amount of inflected forms, so lots and lots of noun forms, lots and lots of verb forms. And if you already know these forms, if you've been introduced to them, we're going to do a recap of all of that in the course. But if you've already been introduced to them, then so many concepts that you have to learn if you looked at Greek for the first time, you already know. And I'm telling you, well, if you look at these verbs in Greek and those verbs, and if you look at these verbs in Sanskrit, which you've already seen, now let me tell you, these verbs in Greek, they're the same in principle. Here are the differences. And now you know how my verbs work. And my verbs is usually sort of the literal nightmare of any Greek students. But if you already have done some Sanskrit, look, here's what this stuff looks like in Greek. It's not that bad. And so the idea is that we have people who either have already done Sanskrit, but I'm also going to teach the course in such a way that it also works for people who haven't done Sanskrit, but who've done Latin, because there are huge similarities between Latin and Greek as well. So if you've already done a highly inflected language, such as Sanskrit or Latin, or there's a couple of others that qualify you, then you're welcome to this new course, which makes use of your already existing knowledge to go through all of Greek grammar in the space of 12 weeks, which is a very short space of time. Then after that course of 12 weeks, where I try to explain to you all the systems, where I try to get you to memorize a certain amount of basic information, I then invite you to join me again for a course reading a Greek prose text, and then another reading a Greek verse text, so that you've seen both of them with my help while I'm still there to hold your hand. And the hand-holding consists of basically me writing a reader that we use for each course that gives you all the information that you as an intermediate student normally need to look up in 20 different sources. All that information I put onto one page, and that page faces the Greek text that you are trying to make sense of, so that I can take you through a good amount of reading original Greek texts and get you properly familiar with all the forms, all the endings, all the vocab, all the syntax, the constructions that way. Because, and that is a trend in language education at the school level, so, teaching little children used to be really, really good. It's becoming less and less available in many countries, with every passing year. In the UK, very often high quality language education is pretty much is very often limited to fee paying schools, not to state schools. The target group of language teaching, whether it's modern living languages or ancient literary languages, is increasingly adults. But the teaching materials very often are the traditional teaching materials aimed at little children who can memorize everything sort of like that, but compacted so that you still need to do all the memorization right at the front, but you need to do it in even less time than the little children had. And that is really, really difficult. I don't know about you, but I find that I cannot just take a poem and know it by the end of the day and still know it the next day. I cannot take large lists of vocab and memorize them and still know them the next day or a week after. I could do that when I was 10, can't really do it now. And so what I'm trying to do is create resources in language teaching that are aimed at adults. They're often not really welcomed because they're quite different from what we see so far and what we've seen in the past. But what we've seen in the past is the way it is because it's compacted teaching materials aimed at the brains of young children who can soak all the information up like a sponge, but who wouldn't necessarily be able to grasp the larger structures that are behind languages. Whereas if you teach adults, understanding the large structures is often not that difficult. Keeping in mind all the tiny, tiny little details, that is difficult. And so we need to teach in such a way that the memorization isn't fronted, isn't seen as a prerequisite of proper, serious, detailed language study, but we front all the concepts, we front all the structures, and then we give them the opportunity to get to know the little bits of information that need to be memorized while they already read the texts they want to read, which is either with ancient languages, literary texts, or with modern languages, whatever newspaper you want to read, whatever conversation you want to be able to follow, bit, when you're already engaging with that which is your goal in learning that language. Don't know whether that's a trend, but that's definitely what I'm doing, because the trend that definitely is there is we need more basic and intermediate language instruction aimed at, constructed for, with adults in mind.
And adults who have not necessarily taken Greek or Latin.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. And so you were in the beginning mentioning the discussion on the Indology mailing list, and there people were also saying, oh, well, there is that and that grammar from the 19th century, which is there to teach people Sanskrit, and it also expects them to already know Latin or Greek. And in that grammar that they were talking about in that discussion, this was in the title. This was made explicit. But what I try to say is that no, all of these materials are aimed at people who know Latin and Greek. They just don't say it because it goes without saying, it's obvious. There wouldn't be anyone coming to Harvard wanting to study Sanskrit who hadn't already done a proper amount of Latin. And when you read the standard Latin reader, Landman, which is from the 1880s, I think. It's really funny. When you read the details, when you read the notes, sometimes he gives you a translation of a phrase, not into English, but into Latin or into Greek, because it's an obvious parallel for someone who knows Latin. And obviously all his students would have known Latin, and obviously our students nowadays don't. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
there, unspoken, and I think we need to be aware of that fact and then adapt the means of instruction to today's standards and today's students.
Well, again, you seem to be instinctively uh, rubbing up against barriers to accessibility, and you were trying to augment accessibility. Whether the assumption is overt or implicit or explicit that one needs to have studied Latin before having say this text. Part of that might have to do with a degree of education, and part of that might have to do with a degree of pedigree, right? And so again, we have certain structures that, this is just part of. There's nothing to ultimately begrudge in that all societies and all sort of traditions have these structures of power and structures of inclusion and exclusion, and we're just becoming more conscious of the ways in which we exclude people, hopefully unwittingly. And this is one such barrier I think you're trying to ameliorate. Would you say then, from a neutral stance in this day and age, would you say that there is an asset if one were to be interested in Latin and or Sanskrit, for example, or Greek? Would you say that there might be a sensible order of operation, or just say that it really doesn't matter which language you learn first?
Well, this is something that goes on in it's sort of a conversation that's gone on in my brain for a very long time.
Oh, good.
Uh, it can go either way, and it really depends on the individual that we're talking about. If you, for example, start with Sanskrit, then you've been exposed to all these forms and all these declensions and all these verb forms and everything. And if you then go on to Latin, basically that's a path from many forms and very few syntactic rules to far fewer forms and more syntactic rules. And then if you go on after that to Greek, then you have fewer forms than in Sanskrit, but definitely more syntactic rules than in Latin. And so if you go from Sanskrit to Latin to Greek, that would be one path of doing it. The other path is, if all of this, when I say inflection, declension, ending, suffix, if all of that is new and sort of nervousness inducing, then maybe a good first language might be Latin, because starting from English, starting from German, starting from modern European languages, Latin is sort of closest to what we're used to, because comparatively speaking, it has the fewest number of forms that you need to memorize: noun forms, verb forms, and so on. So from that point of view, it may make sense to start with Latin. But my conviction that I came to at some point, and that I currently hold, and that may very well change as I continue thinking about this. But my conviction right now is, if you find something that you're really interested in, if there is this ancient Greek text that you want to read, say, for example, you're a Christian and want to read the New Testament. Say you're a Catholic and you want to read the Bible in Latin. Say you are a Hindu or a Buddhist who wants to read a particular Sanskrit text. Say you're not religious at all and you want to read a particular text in that language. Having that goal makes it so much easier to study that language, because learning a language, again in air quotes, learning a language is an open-ended process. I cannot say that I have learned Sanskrit. There's loads of Sanskrit learning that I still need to do, but I have learned enough Sanskrit that I am able to read specific texts. So the goal of learning a language is not really a goal you can reach because you can always improve your knowledge of that language. But being able to read a text in the original, that is a precise and very achievable goal. So if there is a specific text you're interested in and you're learning the language so that you can read that text, that is much more doable than this open-ended, I want to learn X. And secondly, I think it's a lot less important how difficult the material is and a lot more important how good the teacher is. If you have a teacher where you think, yeah, I can see myself learning with them. I sort of, enjoy their classes. I like their method works for me. Then go with that teacher. It doesn't matter whether that teacher teaches Greek or Latin or Sanskrit, or then takes you outside of Indo-European at all and is a brilliant teacher of Japanese. It doesn't matter. If you work well with that teacher, then that is what will get you to where you want to go. That would be my take on it, based on my own experience, because when I was a student, I wasn't sure, when I was a high school student, I wasn't sure whether I wanted to become a physicist or wanted to become, a classicist or something else. Or rather, no, I was completely convinced that I was going to be an astrophysicist. And that's what I was going to do at university. And then in the last years of school, my language teachers were brilliant. And some of my science teachers were good, but some of them really weren't. And that's how I then ended up being in classics and then, Indo-European and Indology, where I'm very happy. I have no idea whether I would have made a good physicist. Really don't know. But the reason why I chose this path is because I was inspired to do so by teachers who spoke to me, who offered insight in a way that worked for me.
There's so much there, parampara, indeed. It is really that relationship with whatever medium of learning that's so vital. I really had this extraordinary experience of having such a kind and lovely Sanskritist who first taught me Sanskrit. I didn't even have we were using Coulson that year, my very first semester of Sanskrit, 2005, I believe it was. And she literally loaned me her own personal copy of the book to go home over the weekend and get caught up because I enrolled in the course. I never enroll in things late. That's just not me, but I was wandering. Something just pulled me to this class. It was inexplicable. My schedule was already full. I was working half time. Someone mentioned it. I went back to the University of Toronto to finish a degree, and somebody mentioned the class, and I just could not get this idea out of my brain. It was so surreal. And I wandered the halls, and I'm like, I know that this class is in this Sydney Smith, it's called, this building in Central University of Toronto. I'm like, I know it's in this here somewhere. And I show up to this class late for the class, late for the course by a week. And, it was like when the Monsignor gifts Valjean with the silver. and, and so I'm gifted with this book, with this text, make yourself an honest man, Raj, so her kindness and her graciousness really helped. Sanskrit was not an easy language to learn. I'm not a linguist by nature. I do quite enjoy the language profusely for a variety of reasons. But really, I studied with her, and she was a sessional appointment. They got together some funds just to hire her for a couple of years because some students needed some language training, and then I got to study with a tenured Sanskritist who ended up in East Asian studies because of some difficulties, and the department dispersed over time, and it was a very, very difficult and challenging experience where it was the only B plus I ever got in my life because she was convinced that I was a native Hindi speaker, and I was hiding that because I wanted to be a breeze by. I don't speak Hindi. And then towards the end, she was convinced that I copied my translation from someone else, and so rather than failing, she gave me B plus, which I'm not sure which would have been B plus on my transcript. And I thought, that was for my master's year, but thankfully I had this wonderful, brilliant, charming, very, very kind Sanskritist from my undergrad when I went back to finish my undergrad. But if it was the other way around, I would have been so poisoned by this relationship that I wouldn't have returned to Sanskrit. So I can really deeply resonate with what you say with, when folks find a teacher that they resonate with, it can make or break their relationships to the area of study, especially a language which by necessity, you don't just do one semester of a language if you need to do anything with the language. It's sort of a long game enterprise. I'm just a nerdy, intuitive footnote. Footnote number 42 here is yes, I'm looking into my crystal ball. Alternate paths, alternate destinies. Diva says that you would have made a brilliant physicist. You would have pushed back against the standard model and illumined all of the stuff that they tried to obfuscate. And you would have figured out some things by pushing back against the institutional defense of things that are indefensible in physics. But anyhow, aside from that, yeah.
Well, I kind of doubt that because my feeling is that well, yeah, let's just simply say I have no idea whether I would have been any good as a mathematician or as a physicist or in any of those numerical subjects. I don't know. But what I do know is that I'm very happy that I always describe my life as a series of happy accidents, that, through a series of happy accidents, a long series, I then ended up where I am right now. But
There's no
what
question.
one other thing that I wanted to say, coming back to, the question of trends in language teaching. So, what I was trying to describe earlier is how I use my students' prior language learning knowledge to teach whatever I want to teach them. So, for example, if you already know Latin, then teaching you Sanskrit is so much easier. But what I also do is the best I can to use my students' first language knowledge, so their native tongue or their native tongues, use their knowledge of that in my classes, which often then accuses people, it ends up with people accusing me of, I came here for a class in Sanskrit, but somehow I ended up in a class in Sanskrit and a class on English grammar. So I want people to be aware of the things that they already know through their native language. And that's also the reason why I then wrote this book, that is this Sanskrit textbook that is aimed at German speakers. One reason why I'm excited about this book and why I'm excited, this is kind of a side effect, touching upon all those things that we've been talking about, the side effect of publishing it with Amazon is that I retain the copyright, so I can do with that book whatever I want. And just recently, a former student, now friend of mine, who so learned Sanskrit with me, and who's so in her professional life, she's a translator for Spanish and French. She said, could I translate that book into Spanish? And when she wants to translate it, she doesn't just mean translating, she means localizing it. So giving examples and using explanations that work for people who already speak Spanish. And, she's doing that right now, and we'll be working on this together because obviously you need someone with a good knowledge of Spanish, active knowledge of Spanish, not just sort of being able to speak it, but being able to reflect about it. You need someone with a good knowledge of Sanskrit. And so we're working on this together, and I'm quite excited by that. And that's also something that I have hopes for is going to be happening not just with Spanish and French, but I have someone who possibly is interested in translating this or localizing it into Portuguese, possibly even for Chinese. Not quite sure whether, how that is going to go, where that is going to go, obviously, because, the other languages, they're all Indo-European languages, like Sanskrit, and so you can go a lot on the basis of this is what we do, and look, it's very similar in Sanskrit with that one difference. Whereas when it comes to Chinese, which structurally works completely differently, you then have to take a rather different approach and say, look, this is how we do this, which is completely different from the way Sanskrit does it. But here, look, you are now learning to do this thing in Sanskrit, which in your own language you would use for this purpose, to ask this kind of question, to make this kind of statement, and so on. And so that's something that I am cautiously very excited by, because that's always been a bit of a bugbear for me, that I'm very, very grateful that we have English as this language of universal communication through which all of us can talk to each other, through which we can read each other's publications and so on. But the knowledge of one's native tongue, this is something that is so, it's subconscious, it's so deep down within us. We know a lot more than we're aware we know. You know, I don't know the rules of how language works. I just know what is right or what is wrong. And when then someone tells me, oh, look, you know, you are doing this and this in English, or you're doing this and this in German, so my native language. And look, you know, that and that language happens to do the exact opposite, or that and that language happens to do the exact same thing. That automatically gives me a level of access to what that other language is doing that I don't have if I just learn it via, well, there is this theoretical rule which says the following. And so I'm really hoping that with this book, which, as I say, does not have any copyright, I'm not, you know, getting rich of it, and the goal is not to get rich off this book, that we can maybe use this to make Sanskrit, I hope, good Sanskrit instruction accessible to people whose first language is not English, which is, after all, the reason why I wrote this book, because I was asked by German native students for a good Sanskrit textbook that is in German and directed at German students. So I'm really, as I say, cautiously excited, but if this were to work out, it would be so wonderful.
Well, at this point, excitement sounds warranted. I probably received easily a half a dozen emails in the last year or two from people who were like, you know, Dr. Raj, I really love your stories behind the stories behind the posts. This is my only public book, more for the sort of yoga education sort of community. And they're like, you know, I'd love to translate this into Spanish, into Vietnamese, into Russian, and can we collaborate on this? I'm so sorry. Please contact the press. I have no idea if this is permissible or possible or already underway. I mean, sometimes I discover that there are new translations of my own book only because a student tells me or I see it somewhere, and I'm not sure what they have in store. I mean, not even a knock against the press. I'm sure they have reasons for why they. I've been asking them to do an audiobook for a couple of years because I've gotten dozens of requests to have an audiobook in my voice. But yeah, no, I do understand. I completely appreciate the apparatus of the publisher who can get the word out there, depending on the publisher and the niche and all that. And also, of course, then there are limitations because the copyright belongs to the publisher, and you have to have your level of range of motion, especially in that you're not looking for a line on the CV necessary. You're not looking for credentialing, and even if you were ever to apply for an academic job, you have more than sufficient credentialing for those purposes. So it's great to have that range of motion to be like, yes, let's translate this book into Swahili. Why not? I love it. You are clearly, you know, clearly it seems that however much you love physics, I think you're really meant to do this because you're good at it and you really enjoy it. And I would like to maybe ask, what is it that if you had to think, if you had to sort of discuss, kind of ascertain, what the passion piece for you, is it the contours of the language? Is it access to the texts? Is it just sharing this knowledge? Like, this lights you up, and obviously most of our passions are by definition transrational. But what is it that most excites you about this enterprise?
This is going to sound very, very cheesy, but
Well, it was a cheesy question.
okay, good. Well, then I'm going to give you an appropriately cheesy answer. I think this is all access. This all gives us access to an understanding of what it means to be human. Because if you live in one place, you get to know that place very well. You develop your thoughts very well. You encounter certain things that are difficult. You encounter certain things that amuse you, certain things that make you sad, that make you angry. But so often it is a lot easier to understand ourselves if we see how other people have done this. Yeah. Say, for example, the teenager who is unhappily in love for the first time. They think that the world has never been as painful for anyone as it is for them right now. Well, then just give them, some of the world's best literature, which is exactly about how we deal with this fact that, we need to open ourselves up so that we can feel love fully. But by opening ourselves up by that exact act, we just make ourselves so vulnerable to everything that we then feel when, that love goes wrong. That is something that you can access through literature, through thoughts captured in words. Then at the other end, so many of us want to know what happens after we die. What is death? What happens after we die? Are we here for a purpose? What is the nature of the universe? And obviously, some of these questions, what is the nature of the universe? Some part of the answer has to be answered by the physicists. But then other parts as to, the things that we cannot measure and that we just try to understand with our human faculties of reasoning, it's really wonderful when you then read, what, some Latin, some Roman wrote, someone who we don't know who exactly they were, who were the authors of parts of the Rig Veda, what they wrote. You see that there are so many different approaches to these questions that concern all of us as humans. And for me, I'm a person who likes to who feels safest in a field of study where there's a right and wrong, where there's a correct and an incorrect. And that's why my field of main study and research is language, where, I can say this is a possible translation, but it's unlikely to be right because this is a translation that is wrong because look, this is a dative, not an accusative or something like that. So I'm always happiest when I can go with facts. And when it comes to language learning and language reconstruction and language structures, there is a right and a wrong. Other people are more at the other end of the spectrum. They're not so much focusing on the language, but on the texts that are created by those languages. And so those would then be the people who are the literary studies people, the philosophers, the religious studies people. And so we all, come together to work on trying to make sense of this weird thing we call existence. And I feel that I found my little corner in this big enterprise where I can do something where I'm regularly told I'm being helpful. And I enjoy what I do, and so that's what it's about for me.
Yeah, that's beautiful, profound, and deeply resonant. I mean, so many times, whether in one of the school's courses or even at the OCHS or even for sort of exegesis on the Bhagavad Gita, Wisdom Wednesdays we call it, the school. What we arrive at is look at this people into the human experience, this dance between defamiliarization and refamiliarization, and having this foreign expression or idiom actually help you see yourself, your world, your loved ones anew in a certain way, and then the mindset of individuals who are equally modern Homo sapiens, but using a linguistic tool that's so radically different. It's like having access to the same scene from a whole different camera angle in a certain sense, and it's really is beautiful and profound. I mean, one of the most fascinating things that you said in passing, which really resonates, is that yes, of course, empiricism is important. Of course, science as a methodology for ascertaining what is physically and empirically and factually true is indispensable, and yet anyone who pays attention to themselves or children or really life can palpably experience that which cannot, at least as far, be measured. And so, the things, the aspects of the human experience that we can't really quantify and maybe not even measure. And so I play with this idea a lot that, irrespective of our ontological views or religious views, the profound wisdom in so many Sanskrit words like Maya, all that we perceive in a phenomenal sense, without taking an extreme sort of Advaita Vedanta, and it's all projection. Yet all that we perceive with the senses is measurable, and that which we can measure is ultimately illusory when measured against the immeasurable. That is, there are these concepts that are innate in the very grammatical structures that you can't unsee once they're pointed out. And so it's not just grammar, it's entire modes of feeling and being and viewing the human experience. So that's a really deeply resonant idea. Now that we've waxed poetically and critiqued culture and thought aloud, Thinking aloud is allowed, I hope. Um, is there anything else about the German translation, about language training in general, about Sanskrit studies, about the academy or the nature of being that you'd like to touch on? Any of those echelons that you'd like to touch on else before we close for today?
Well, actually, I think also in the interest of our readers, I think we have been chatting for some time. But no, I very much enjoyed this conversation. I think it's I'm sorry, this sounds very arrogant if I say this as a participant of the conversation, but I think this is an important conversation to have because we all agree. You and I agree. I would assume that many of your listeners agree that the academic enterprise is an important one. Is a very important one. And so whenever I say negative things about certain elements of academia, it's not so much that I want to diss them, it's more that I want to say I am unhappy that certain aspects of this very important thing are not the way they should be, are not the way that allows them to fulfill the functions that I think they have properly. And the functions of academia have to just be not only doing research, but also educating, passing on that research, starting the discussion, being allowed to be wrong, putting something out there, knowing full well that it's not fully developed yet, in the hopes that by putting it out there, someone else will come along and say, oh, I've thought about this and I can contribute in this way. And then you make things better, you go in the right direction, rather than having put something out there that has an aspect that is wrong and therefore being penalized for having said something that's partly new and right and partly new and wrong. So I hope that discussions like this one that are aimed at disseminating knowledge, understanding, just the joy of it all, the joy of learning. I hope that there will be many more of those. And of course, I'm hopeful that maybe one or two German speakers listen to this and might be interested in trying out the German textbook. I'm teaching a German language, German medium Sanskrit course based on it starting mid-September. So if anyone's interested, get in touch.
Yeah, that is such an important point. I view what you're saying, along with perhaps my own perspective, as functioning along the lines of renovation versus wrecking ball. We're not aiming to tear the academy down. We value it to the point that we want to raise the bar for it to fulfill its function and meet the needs of people. I mean, it's not a question of down, we're not quite storming the Bastille here. We're trying to renovate the Bastille in some sense. And so that's very, very resonant actually. And the other point she made, I learned the hard way that naively I accepted and respected that no one's work is perfect. And certainly when we publish a book, it's not perfect. It's not nothing. And so, I naively, I think some people like yourself and many scholars will understand the importance of a safe space to discuss aloud our ideas. And there are others who fault finding is their go-to ammunition to, well, this is wrong, so we'll discredit you as a person or as a scholar or as this or that. And really, it's like this podcast. I've covered work on this podcast that was diametrically opposed from other work that I covered on this podcast. I've covered people who are each other's nemesis. I don't care. My dharma on the podcast is not to critically engage the work. I can do that in an article or at a conference, charitably, hopefully. My dharma is to showcase the work that's being done, that's been peer reviewed, or in your case, that's self-evidently, substantial. And I think hopefully more and more of our ideological compadres are understanding that the function of the podcast is not to take sides and then these factions. It's to showcase the conversations. It's a space for conversation. Let's have conversation with our differing ideas. I think it's vital.
And especially on this podcast, we can do this. I feel that you can do this because very often putting someone else down is a strategy to make sure that job, an opportunity, a grant goes not to them, but to someone that you're trying to favor, so someone who's your protege and so on. So it's not necessarily to say this person is bad. It is to with some certain further thought behind it, some purpose behind it. And in this podcast, I'm not taking up anybody else's space by chatting with you. You can simply have an extra episode. You can, you have the resources, you make the space, which I think we're all very grateful for, so that when there are more publications, there are more conversations, there are more podcast episodes. But even what I would hope for, even in this space where, academic space, where there are not unlimited jobs, there is not unlimited airtime or something like that, it would be lovely if we had all in mind or as our main interest, the advancement of knowledge and understanding, rather than the thoroughly human and thoroughly understandable, oh, this person is really lovely and they should get a job, and therefore I'm going to put down their opponent. I wish there was less of the latter.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I've said a number of times, I think in different ways in the podcast, that among the intelligent. I mean, that's. I mean, I have the good fortune of speaking with professors and highly intelligent people, students, day in and day out. But among the intelligent, where there's a modicum or a decent level of critical thinking, deconstruction is not difficult. Fault finding is not difficult among the intelligent. The next level, to my mind, is illuminating. Is what do you posit? How do you bring these ideas together? How do you? It's some yoga. Yoga is not hard. It's some yoga. Like, how do we create space for multiple perspectives? Because there are going to be multiple perspectives, and how do we, you know, if I've had person X on my podcast, they're sharing their perspective and their scholarship. That doesn't mean there's any alliance or faction. That just means, hey, let the public decide. Let our colleagues decide. There are those who are going to deeply resonate with this conversation and feel like we've been living in their brains, and they're going to partake in this out loud. There are those who are going to deeply resonate and feel the same way and not say a word because they're up for tenure next year. there are those who are going to be like, my goodness, these renegades, how dare they? That's fine. I love that we can have the conversation.
Suppose the renegades probably wouldn't be here, well over an hour into this conversation.
There was a clip from I don't know if you know Howard Stern. He was a great provocateur on the radio, and it was like people who love him, very very sensationalist radio figure. The people who love him, what's the number one reason of why you listen to him? I want to hear what he's going to say next. People who hate him, what's the number one reason why you listen to him? I want to hear what he's going to say next. So who knows? But thank you very much for being on the podcast.
My very great pleasure.
For those listening, we have been speaking with none other than Dr. Antonia Ruppel about her many language Sanskritic enterprises. In the podcast notes, you will see a link to her personal website. You will see a link to this fascinating couple of German language resources for budding Sanskritists, as well as her upcoming yogic studies course. Until next time, keep well, keep listening, keep reading, and keep contemplating the future of Sanskrit and beyond.